So why are we doing this? We're doing this because nonprofits are a rich holder of rich data and useful data, and as governments at various levels devolve more and more functions to nonprofits, you've seen how governments have been starting to open up their data from the municipal and provincial and federal levels. And we'd like to see nonprofits do a bit more of data sharing and opening up their data. So we have a great panel of experts with some experience and some thoughts on this subject. And what I'm going to ask them to do is give us either, they have the sheet with your bio on there, written bio. So either give us a short introduction or an introductory remark if you'd like to.
I'll start. My name is Bill Morris. I work for United Way of Canada, and I'm involved in, I started out my life doing government relations for United Way, but somehow that evolved into 211, and I'm not a techie. I actually have a fine arts background, but my interest in data is all about the social impact that the data can have and the way in which data can be used. My kind of ultimate objective is to use data to make sure that our social service and human services infrastructure is as responsive to human needs as it can be. So that's my kind of motivation in all this.
So I'm Melanie Gorka. I am a co-founder partner of a small organization called Commons 11. We help organizations and communities to harness technology in international development, community development, environment, and even in government. And so my interest in open data, or data in general, started when I was working with a group called Crisis Commons and Random Acts of Kindness. And I saw the power of people to create their own solutions when they had the right information and access to tools to actually create their own solutions. Coming from international development, I actually really sort of was against the way organizations and multilateral organizations really hoard information and don't embrace lessons learned, and think that that people don't have the agency to help themselves, but rather we need to provide solutions. So I'm really interested in how we can actually put information into people's hands, not just data, but tools and lessons learned, best practices, access to technologies in order to use them with open data or with data in order to create real life solutions.
My name is Stephanie McAllister. I work for a nonprofit called TimeRaiser. Some of you might have heard of us. We run an art auction where we auction off the artwork for volunteer hours instead of for money. But some of our other projects, that's just one of our programs, some of our other projects are trying to find ways to help other nonprofits use technology more efficiently to be transparent, especially in their impact reporting. Like Bill, I'm not a techie either. My background is in English literature, but I brought sort of my researcher lens to nonprofit websites in particular. We're trying to develop a bit of a baseline to understand how well nonprofits in Canada are sharing information online. And some of our other projects are running workshops for nonprofits across the country in tandem with our TimeRaiser events to sort of introduce them to new, especially cloud tools, and in order to share more of their financial and impact statistics online.
Hi, my name is Heather Leeson. I work for a Kenyan open source company called Ushahidi. We are open source interactive map, data visualization, interactive mapping software. It gets used for election monitoring, crisis response, and civil society work. It's been used in 159 countries. Think of it as citizen voices, citizen data, and a layer of open data or sensor data on top of it to be able to tell different kinds of stories. In addition to that, I'm going to be joining the Open Knowledge Foundation in a couple of days. So I'm very interested in open data and open information. And I've worked in tech for 15 years in internet technologies. And much like Melanie, I feel that there's this connection of connecting technologists and technical information to help nonprofits for tech for social good. I think that the sheer ability to level the playing field and to help you do the good work that you're doing needs to happen from people like us to be able to organize it from a technology sort of way, but also in trying to create standards. And Open Knowledge Foundation is really interested in creating those standards and working with Open Government Partnership and Open Data to try and build that forward. So I look forward to all your questions and the conversation today.
Hi, I'm Gabe Zani, and I'm going to be helping out Ujnish with some of the questions today. But my background is in technology as a creative technologist, though my work more recently is in the realm of innovation, in innovation consulting for nonprofits and government and for-profits. And I've been involved in the open data community for a long time, and was one of the organizers of the this year's Open Data Day in Toronto, where we made an effort to specifically bring in nonprofits and other organizations that are working in the social space but using data as part of their achieving their impact.
So the way we're kind of, this is Gabe and I will kind of go back and forth asking questions, and then once you run out, we'll turn it over to you guys to ask more questions. So I'll start with the first question. So we've thrown out a couple of terms, open data, shared data. Somebody want to take a shot at briefly defining those terms?
Access, shareable, reusable, proper license.
Okay, so you just defined open data, right?
I did.
Okay, somebody want to take a shot at defining or describing shared data and how it might be different from open data?
I don't know about shared data, but I know that some companies or governments are opening up data per use or when consumers opt in. So my company was part of a hackathon called the Mars Energy Hackathon this past weekend, and they were using the Green Button Open Data API, which was like a collaboration between Hydro and the government entities to release some data that consumers had opted in, but it's not open. But you can use it, and it updates, but it's not openly shareable to anybody.
Right.
So if I can, I just maybe, one of the tensions we have within the shared and open, I think, comes down to that issue of license and ownership, right? If you're granting license, then the question becomes, is it truly open, or how open is it? Because licenses are sometimes restrictive. This is a challenge that we've certainly faced in terms of the work that I do. Getting to, people kind of agree on the theoretical basis about open, but often when you get down to the brass tacks about how open you're going to be, what are the limitations of open? It's kind of like, what are the limitations of truth? You often get into some interesting discussions about just how willing we are to be open, because even in the nonprofit sphere, the reality is that as community-spirited as many organizations are, most of our organizations are, many see that data as being valuable, and that value being attached in some way to their funding, to their position, to the work that they do, in a way that sometimes, even for all the right motivations, limits the degree of openness that we're willing to engage in. And for me, that sharing and openness, there's some real interesting turns along the path between those two.
To your point, Bill, and to the example, Melanie, that you were just giving, I'd like to think that the data sharing example that you offered just now, there must have been mutual value to the two groups that were prepared to share data. Could you spell out, perhaps, it was Hydro, you said?
Yeah.
So, and another group, and what value did each get from the sharing of data in your case?
Sure. So, and I might not get this exactly right, I didn't create it, But the idea was so that consumers or that developers could create applications so that consumers could understand their energy usage. So, and with a lot of organizations, governments, nonprofits, the dive into being truly open is quite difficult. So this was a way to actually allow consumers and developers to make use of the data with pulling out some of maybe the personal information that you just don't necessarily want to share. And so the value was so that consumers could be more aware of their energy usage. Different applications that could be created could help corporations to be more aware, so that eventually that awareness could turn into action around it. Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Would an example of that be when you go to the Hydro website, you can see what the average consumption is for, say, a 2-family home or 4-family, that sort of thing, to compare how you are with the average?
Yeah, and it could go a little bit more specific into that.
I wonder, it might be good to go around if you have particular examples of sort of data sharing success stories in the nonprofit space that can give us something to start off with.
Sure.
So whoever wants to go.
I guess I'll go. I have it. At our organization, we share all of our budgeting information in real time online using simple sort of Google Docs embeds. And that's been really helpful on many levels. And one, it helps us to be very transparent. Just a side note about open data, the budgetary information we share is of a non-personal nature, i.e. we'll know what our staffing costs are for the year, but not per specific staff member. So there's that kind of level of privacy that's built into that, but overall our operating budget is open. And like I said, that's been really a success for us in terms of being transparent to our stakeholders, but also for funders, find it a really easy and quick way for them to sort of see a bird's eye view of the organization.
Are you aware of other nonprofits that share data in that way?
It's certainly we're in the minority in that sense. There is, some trepidation perhaps about sharing that kind of information. We are currently incubating another nonprofit that's taken on our model. But yeah, other than that, off the top of my head, I can't think of one that has their full operating budget up in real time.
I have 2 examples from the crisis mapping world. And so crisis mapping is using data and citizen data to be able to help people during emergencies. And there's a network of 5,000 people that are map agnostic that use data around the world during emergencies. So whether it be the UN, whether it be the International Red Cross and Red Crescent, or even just your lay folks who are digital volunteers, like Melanie mentioned about Random Hacks and Crisis Commons. There's another group called the Standby Task Force, which I'm a member of, that does this kind of work. Anyway, the 2 examples are as follows. Syria Deeply is a project that's occurring right now, and what they are doing is they're using UNHCR data, so all the refugee data, and then a local group from Syria that is tracking deaths, and they are mapping that data overlaid to be able to show where the refugees are going, where the actions are happening in Syria, to be able to help with food resourcing, and also to be able to highlight that this is happening in Syria. The second example is far more random in the fact that during Hurricane Sandy last fall, there were 29 to 32 different mapping projects, whether they be using ESRI, which is government data, or using Google Maps, or using Ushahidi's maps, or other data sets. We decided as a community to collect all the different data sets, to provide a spreadsheet with the links for all the data sets so that people would have access to that data to be able to take it and add it to their maps to be able to make some decisions about, where are the co-working spaces that are open? Where is the damage? Where do people need help? Where is Occupy New York going in? How are they helping with what's happening in along the coast? So the idea that data could be used during an emergency with maps in a global community, that sounds kind of shocking, but that to me, those are the 2 best examples I can give you.
So one of the examples I can give is a project that we're incubating called Water Voices. It was created at a hackathon, and the idea was trying to see what sort of water-related crises existed in Canada. And we had found some data that said that over 131 communities across the country have been under boil water advisories for a few years, up to 15 to 20 years. And so the tool that was created was a mapping tool using Ushahidi, which allowed people to actually create stories and reports around their water problems. So if they had problems, brushing their teeth because they had to boil water. What we ended up noticing and doing was that nobody had a comprehensive database on water quality in Canada, much let alone a recent database on water in Canada. So we, using our partner at Open North, created a tool which scraped data across the web. We asked for Freedom of Information requests. We found any sort of water quality that was open data that was available to us, and we created a comprehensive database that did not exist before in Canada. And so now we actually are going to use that in addition to citizen data to create a much better story around water quality in Canada. And then the other example is a project that we did with the UNDP, where it wasn't open data, but they used data in a really interesting way, where they wanted to know how all of their knowledge products, all the platforms that they created on the web were being used and referenced across the web. So using, and sorry, this can be a very technical sounding name, but using something called cybermetric analysis, which is the ability to look across social media for references to a certain title or some keywords that are found within it. We were able to actually track how all of these products were being used across the web and give the UNDP a really good idea of who was using their publications and how. And it was part of a greater impact study that they were doing about the work that they were doing all over the world. So those are ways that you can really use data as a nonprofit.
So let me use an example here in Toronto. 211 was first introduced in Toronto. It was the first place in Canada that was introduced. So there's been a strong and long partnership between 211 Toronto and the City of Toronto. And the information that is used to deliver service maps and keeps track of about 20,000 different services and programs in Toronto. So that's the resource database that's used here in Toronto. The collaboration with the City of Toronto resulted in the use of that data to inform the identification of Toronto's priority neighborhoods. And that process of identifying those priority neighborhoods then led to a subsequent process whereby literally tens of billions of dollars of investment were made in those neighborhoods in order to try and level the playing field to some extent in terms of some of the social infrastructure. So that allowed things like us to look at the availability of services and programs that were targeted at children and youth, and then map that against, in a geospatial way, what is the distance between those concentrations of children and youth and the services that are targeted to them. Find where those mismatches exist. Try to ensure that then the agencies that are delivering those services are aware of where those concentrations are and the gaps that may exist in terms of the availability simply as a result of distance. And so that kind of information increasingly is being used within our sector to inform the service offerings that are being provided to the public in a way that again tries to ensure that they're more responsive. In a more interactive way, because the other source of data that we collect is the data about why people call and what they're calling about, where they're calling from, where they're directed to. So during H1N1, we did a mapping of where people were calling who were reporting symptoms, where people were calling that were looking for inoculation, and working with public health, we're able to use, again, that mapping of that information to better target the resources that are available in the community. Because when that hit, there was actually a period of time of panic initially after a young boy died, where the services for delivering the inoculations were overwhelmed in terms of the response of the public. So just a couple of examples in terms of that information and data sharing that is successful and provides real benefit.
But that was not open though, right? That was just open among the organizations so that they could level it to
Sharing,
each other.
yeah, not open, sharing.
But those are some good examples of international and local sort of examples of success stories. So if I'm a nonprofit. Tell me more about the benefits of sharing my data and what the outcomes might be for me as a nonprofit.
For me, I mean, I've worked in the nonprofit sector, I've worked in the private sector, and somewhere in between. And coming from the nonprofit world, especially international development, nobody really publishes their failures or mistakes or when projects didn't succeed or funding got wasted. And it's not to say that, and I think part of that is that people are afraid of how that looks upon the organization. But what it actually does is shows a much more realistic view of the work that's being done and allows you to see the impact in a way that isn't. So I think that being able to be more open about data and sharing data, one, it will help an organization who's similar not make the same mistake, and hopefully learn something. And by being more open and sharing that knowledge, we can actually make it so that the impact is in the hands of the people who need it rather than wasting it.
I think there's like 3 things that I kind of add to that. Is that you want to kind of reduce the duplication. So someone's got that data, why not, instead of throwing resources to go and recreate that data, why not use that data? That's the first one. The second one is you want to test your assumptions, right? Like, so if your data is set on a certain side of bias, how are you going to know, like, and knowing and having the comparative will help you make some better decisions, which is the third thing, is that if you have more data and more information, that can inform, wow, chair raises, sorry, I have to comment on it. No, but I mean, making better decisions by having all the pieces that might be your blind spots or things that you're missing in order to be able to make your decisions. I think those are some of the big benefits.
And I would just expanding on that. There's some obvious like personal gains that you get as a nonprofit when you're sharing. When we're talking to nonprofits and suggesting it, we say, a lot of these sharing tools mean that you do things much more efficiently with your partners, with your volunteers. So on that level, there's obvious gains. But just on a sector level, the more that we share data, the more trust that we gain from the public. I don't think we can underestimate that. It's as if once we give that knowledge to the public, they can better understand the real money that goes into running a nonprofit. Like the really understanding the infrastructure of a nonprofit, I think is really important.
And I really think that point is key, and I'll come at it from a funder perspective, since I do work for United Way and we're funders. The reality is that if we're successful, we're going to be successful at going out and getting people to donate and give their money. The reality is we have to be able to demonstrate that there's value. And I wouldn't be surprised that there's a level of cynicism out there about human and social services, about the degree to which those services are run efficiently, the impact that they have, all those kinds of things. The data helps us tell the story, and that story is really important if we expect it's that confidence piece. We're in the confidence business, is the reality. People trust that they're going to give their money and it's going to have impact. If we can't demonstrate that, quite frankly, we can't get that money. Governments are in the same position, I'll just say. That the resistance to taxation isn't just knee-jerk. The resistance to taxation, when you probe people about it, it's, the notion is, and my wife's a civil servant, so I'm not subscribing to this, is that the money's wasted. The money isn't going where it's needed. It's not responsive to need. Unless you're able to, in fact, get at that resistance to taxation simply grows, and the cynicism about the role of government, which I, for one, think can be quite positive, and the need to act collectively, it's diminished. So our ability is very much enhanced by our ability to use data to tell those stories effectively And I would agree, both the good and the bad, because quite frankly, it can't be that you're telling a story like it's, you know, Stalinist Russia, that everything is sweetness and light. The reality is it's a bumpy road out there in many cases, but I think people are given greater confidence by telling the story, warts and all, the successes and failures.
Can I add one more thing to that? Rather than just sharing our data so that, you know, we're much more transparent and showing that story, it can also open up the opportunity for the greater public to actually help you with the work that you're doing, or I need to speak up, I think. Can everyone at the back hear all of us, or should we all speak up a little bit? We're good. So, you know, when we open up data and then open it up to the open data community or technologists to actually do something with it, you can define gaps that you wouldn't have noticed because you're so sort of focused on the work that you're doing. And why not, you know, invite a lot of people to sort of suggest some things to you. It might be sometimes really bad, but sometimes you might get a really great idea that comes out of it. And, you know, I think we've all seen what can happen when you do that.
I can't overstate the quality of cross-checking and more is more. It sounds kind of awful if you think about it, like 50 people are going to vote on something, but I have to say that like the idea of being able to build on each other's knowledge has been something that's been executed throughout centuries, and so we just need to think about open data as a way to do that across our areas of knowledge.
Now, can I just say something? You put that question in the context of the benefit to the agency. And in some cases, there is a benefit to the agency, I won't deny, because better information, good agencies will use that information to provide better service offerings, get rid of some of the duplication, all that kind of thing. There's a double edge to it, though, as well. In some cases, you know, you need to think about both sides of this. The reality is that I love that kind of crowdsourcing as a way of actually getting us better data. But just as, you know, Wikipedia put Britannica out of business in many respects, that also has an impact. I'm not going to suggest that I think we should be sheltered from that impact, far be it. But as we move down that road of open data, and as we move down the road of increasingly accessing the public for that cross-checking and making sure that that has a positive impact on our quality, it's not necessarily a road without some bumps.
Yeah,
So,
this shouldn't be rogue. It shouldn't be rogue. Like, there should be some moderation. I mean, Wikipedia has moderators, and OpenStreetMap has moderators.
Absolutely.
So just a quick follow-up on that. So if I represent a nonprofit that's going to publish data, isn't it possible that all my failures will be exposed and my performance metrics that I'm not doing well will be exposed, and other nonprofits might steal my data and do something with it?
I'm really interested if I use the word steal. I think it's really important as a sector to sometimes not borrow the language of the for-profit sector and saying, okay, if what I've done has a benefit to another organization, then it's all the better. For example, we like as much as possible when we're purchasing things for the events we run to use social enterprises or social procurement is what we call it essentially. So using other nonprofits, you know, spreading the wealth that way. So if you think about this information, think of it as sharing, not as stealing. But I'm sure you used as a word on purpose. Yeah.
I think in the end, you're accountable to the people you're serving. And if you're not accountable to each other as colleagues and as organizations, you're accountable to the citizens you're serving. So if you have something to hide, then there's some work to be done in-house. That's my feeling.
So I'll come hands in the back.
Sorry, I got here a little late, so forgive me if maybe I missed it. Are you guys talking like speculatively, or are there organizations that are actively sharing data already? Somebody taking the lead?
Yes.
Like, who's up front?
Absolutely.
Well, who's up front? What data is there?
So, I guess the example I gave was just our organization shares all of our operating budget in real time.
TimeRaiser.
TimeRaiser.ca. So like not a lot of nonprofits are doing this, but there is a movement starting for nonprofits.
But can I suggest, we did go over some success stories, and they'll be covered in the report. So let's not maybe go over all that ground again.
Did you guys cover anything like campaign metrics? Like, is anybody releasing any information in terms of like streaming information in terms of campaigns as they're going on, or is it just summary information? Like, what's going on in that regard?
I think different organizations are doing different things. Some are increasingly moving towards real-time data. And the degree to which you can be really helpful.
Yes.
There's one thing I wanted to mention about sharing data that I find really helpful is that it just means that you don't have to recreate the wheel each time.
Yes.
I'm with some environmental groups, and we're all posting things all about nature issues or doing botanical surveys or whatever it is. So as long as you see what other groups have done, you don't have to do it yourself, and that's a really wonderful thing. I just want to mention that, but the other part is that there's the downside when you talked about stealing, and I have to think about Facebook and some of those other organizations, because right out front is anything you post here can be used by us for whatever reason we feel fit. And there are all kinds of websites that I found that you upload a picture, they own it. Like there's that aspect of openness that I think really goes too far. But then there's the openness of sharing information amongst groups that are.
And did you want to respond? 2 points.
I don't. Maybe this is beyond our topic here.
Or just to build on that, like what are maybe some risks that you've encountered or some issues that people have in terms of like sharing data in this way?
I think the biggest risk is in PII, like personal identifying information. As a crisis the biggest risk is in personal information as far as I'm concerned, and I mean all of us want to scrape and clean data. This summer I worked with the Data Science Social Fellows at University of Chicago. We were building tools to be able to take off people's names, phone numbers, and look for sensitive information in different kinds of data sets to be able to clean that and think of it from a tool point of view, because these are things that we do not want to share. And certainly that's not something that somebody who might be using any nonprofit services would want people to share. There are some really great tools right now being made, but there's also some guidelines. The International Red Cross Red Crescent, believe it or not, has written data privacy guidelines for missing persons, which is actually going to be used by many other organizations. The Oxfam has created an amazing data set about how to use data. UN OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, is doing that. So all these big top-level organizations are thinking about how do we protect and clean data in order to be able to go forward. And so for me, it's the privacy and security of the people we're trying to help.
Can I come at it maybe from a different angle, and that is that sometimes, and it gets also at your question, I talked about the 2 kinds of information that we collect. When we're collecting the transaction data on calls, and we receive hundreds of thousands of calls, that has value. There's no question it has value. But we've struggled with the degree to which someone is calling with a problem, and how big a list of questions do you put in front of them in terms of providing service to them so that you can get all that data versus helping the person, in many cases, who's in desperate need of the help. So there's a struggle sometimes in terms of the collection of good quality data, because the best quality data is data that's consistently collected from everybody in exactly the same way, so that it's very structured. And so we've struggled with that in the context of trying to find the balance between recognizing there's value to that information, but also recognizing that we have a responsibility to the individual who's calling to not put a kind of a survey wall between them and getting what they need, and recognizing that they're both a client as well as a source of information.
And to build on Bill's point, I was part of a meeting with a government agency who was talking about just some of these issues internally, and one of the points that was brought up was that any public individual can ask for a freedom of information request. So why not take the chance to actually decide what data you're going to put out there, be able to clean it yourself, to be able to ensure that those personal information is stripped out of it when you have time to do it, rather than when you're given 24 hours, 48 hours to produce this data set. Why not ensure that those questions are answered before they're asked?
There are a couple of hands at the back. Yeah, go ahead.
So you touched on moderation, which I think is the start of a discussion around, so you take 2 data sources, you put them together, and then you have this resource, broader resource that needs to be stewarded. So just curious whether you have any success, failure, good practices, anything in the realm of how do you steward that data effectively and transparently and sort of engender trust.
So was that me?
Go ahead.
Just in general.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know whether it was a specific question and follow up. I think that's a challenge to us in the sense that ultimately, again, if we come back to trying to produce social value, social impact, there's, if that's the lens that you're bringing to the exercise, that's one part of this. But then you do need to put in place those safeguards again in terms of privacy and what is the purpose for which the information was collected, and how do you, even though there's a kind of tertiary value or process that can lead to value, how do you make sure that you're being true to mission? So part of it, quite frankly, and this may sound simply elementary, but the reality is what is your mission? And sometimes I deal with nonprofits and I deal with a large variety of nonprofits. That can be a complex question because it often is lost on the board that who thinks that growing the organization is the mission, or some other thing, that the generation of public value may come into conflict with growing the organization, for example, or the need to diversify your income streams and you've relied on selling some aspect of that data is now actually contrary to your public benefit mission. So in many cases, I think that it really requires a reality check with your mission, and are you in fact being true to your public mission?
So let's just repeat the question for the mic. So the question was about best practices in combining and sharing data. Somebody else want to respond?
I've got an example.
No, I said go ahead.
Okay. So I work with Ushahidi, and we're a Kenyan-based company. And the Kenyan elections happened in March of this year. In 2007, 2008, the elections resulted in post-election violence. And so there was a lot of moderation and election monitoring around the election coming up in 2013. So Kenya is part of organizations trying to open up data sets. So they provided Ushahidi and our community, our network of election monitors, including Creco, and these are people who are in the field who do election monitoring and check and make sure that everything is safe and report back if there's any vote tampering or anything. They provided us with data sets to say, here's where all the polling stations are. So we didn't just take that polling station data and add it to our map. We took it and added to our map, and then we asked our network community to cross-check it and say, is that polling station open? Is it active? Does it have polling ballots? Were there guards there? Was there anything happening? So we had citizens. In addition to that, we had formally trained election monitors cross-checking it and being able to prove that those stations were open. And so that's a way of using data as a power, but also using crowdsourcing to try and do that. But it wasn't just to be clear, it wasn't just, hey, I'm just going to add a verbatim from a text message that came into the map and just add it without checking it. There were actually 200 volunteers that we trained to digitally around the world look at that, moderate and curate it, and add any information and then cross-reference it with other reports. So then you have a human curation and an open data curation. So it's a kind of a not Canadian example for you, but just to see that if we can do this in Kenya, like what can we do here with anything that you're working on?
I think there's one more question on the back. Yeah.
I just had a quick question, which relates to StatsCan. Are they open or shared, or am I completely out in left field?
So repeat the question for the mic. Is StatsCan data open and shared, or what is it?
You have to pay for it.
So
it's a combination of both, I'd say. I mean, there's definitely data that they share, and then they monetize access to data.
Yeah, and just as a researcher, if you're attached to an academic institution, you have a lot more access to StatsCan data in all kinds of formats that you might consider open and accessible, but obviously you have to be attached to some kind of academic institution. Yeah.
But it gets at the question that I think sometimes comes up, and that is, you know, to what degree is the data provided in a way that it can be sliced, manipulated, or is it provided as a finished product, right? And you know, what's exciting about what's happening, and I think in my view, municipal governments are in some cases ahead of our provincial and federal governments in this regard, is that increasingly the way in which data is being provided is it's being provided with tools so that you can screen, filter, manipulate that data in a way which StatsCan, quite frankly, doesn't go there. And you know, there's some real interesting examples of that across municipal government, who I think have embraced the notion of open data to a greater extent than have our provincial and federal governments. Provinces getting into it, certainly BC and Ontario are beginning to move down that road, but I think I've seen a greater degree of municipal leadership on this than leadership from the feds and province.
Yeah, and just as an addition, so municipalities across the world are probably the most advanced in opening up their data, followed by maybe federal governments, and then provincial. In Ontario, the good news is the Privacy Commissioner, she's very pro-open data, actually, you'd be surprised. She wants the government departments to open up their data by design, when they design the systems, when they design the processes, because she believes in transparency. Okay, somebody else? Yeah.
Just to add to this, yes, Dr. Anne Carlokian, Ontario Privacy Commissioner, she gave me access to the microgram data before microgram killed the guy on the Blue Street West. So yes, I have personal experience that Ontario Privacy Commissioner is extremely powerful woman, and she really tries to open and she will, as opposed to the problem which we have with the federal government, which will touch upon, and we have serious issues, and we have high-end data regarding the CRA and CIC, and as we speak every single day there is something closed from them to us, service consumer, which depends on their data for our numerous clients. Basically, what is your position, what is your knowledge about current status or quality of the big data available from the federal government, comparing, for example, to United States Obama's resolution 2011 about the streamlined data services and the data.gov versus our problem on the federal level in terms of big data toward us, client consumers, especially on CRA and CIC, which is of course immigration and new type of newcomers regarding CRA. Huge problems both in their information technology systems, mainframe systems, and access to data which are supposed to be public because it's processing data, not individual information, but data which are supposed to be available and suddenly disappearing day by day.
Okay, so I'm trying to boil that question down to a short one for the mic. So the question is, in the United States, for example, there's very explicit policy of opening up federal government data. Anybody know about the status in Canada?
I'm not expert in that area, I'm afraid, in terms of the federal government's openness. I'm really driving a little bit by the seat of the pants in terms of our experience. We've had some good experience with Citizenship and Immigration Canada in terms of data, but you know, I'm just saying that my own experience is what I'm seeing from the municipalities is just a long way ahead of that in terms of the degree to which it's not just finished data sets, and I was really contrasting StatsCan versus raw data that you can actually get into.
I think I really dream of a day where we are leaders in this in Canada. I really do. I think that there's some steps that have been made. I don't have all the finer details about whether we're open enough or how we're going to get there. I do believe we're not, based on just instincts and what I know from my friends who work with open data in other countries. However, they have relaunched data.gc.ca, And they have a whole participatory arm of it where you can go in and give your feedback. You can go back and join, there's a mailing list to talk about it. So they've started the steps of it. And when I was at the launch that Tony Clement was talking about what they're planning on doing, one of the things that he did say is that they plan on having some more kind of open dialogues with that in the next coming months. So we are going to hold them accountable for that. And I think that you sounds like you're one of those people who should be holding them for accountable since you are working in Canada. I work a lot internationally, so I don't have all the finer details, but I do know that they've started to make a channel so that we can actually have a little bit more voice in that. But I think we need to talk to our MPs or our MPPs, our local councillors, and we're lucky that City of Toronto is really active in open data, right? We're really fortunate that Waterloo and Vancouver and Montreal, like Open North, is doing a fantastic job in that. But what it takes is each of us to think about like what our part in that is, because we can't, as David Miller has said before, when he was speaking TED Talk after he was done being mayor, is that we are responsible for this community, not elected officials. Each of us are responsible for that, and I really take that to heart.
So one of the things that I'm interested in is, from the perspective of many nonprofits, they may not be ready to start posting data sets on their website. But they may recognize the value of sharing their data, and maybe just want to do it in a way that is more with a trusted circle, say. So, are there examples that you know of these kinds of like private data alliances between nonprofits or other organizations?
There are some international groups like IADI, who are sort of international bodies who get together to bring together organizations in international development to provide data. There are events or communities like the Open Data Community who often open up to nonprofits. Joy in the back there with Data for Good is going to be having a data-thon. Is that what you guys are calling it? That allows invited nonprofits to play with data technologists. So those are kind of good ways to jump into it.
I think that there's some really, like if you look, do you mean toolkits? Like how can people, like nonprofits, get started in opening up data, or how are they sharing?
I'm not talking about open at all.
Okay.
I'm only talking. I'm talking about. I'm saying that these are organizations that are not ready for open. They like their leadership will not go there. Okay. They're afraid, and but they want. But that there is an appetite maybe for something on a smaller scale.
I think Plan International did a fantastic job, and that's Linda Raftery. If you've ever read her blog about how she's tried to work with open data and the work that she's doing with children. I'm really impressed with how she tried to get different organizations in Benin and Cameroon to talk about how do they about violence against children and how can they share that detail among themselves, the kids that are most risk. This is not something that should be published on the internet anywhere, but the fact that these organizations were sharing even that kind of information for the most people at risk, I take a look at her blog. She's got some great details on that.
Just some little case studies in that regard. We've attempted to work with a variety of organizations that collect similar data in a way that says, if we're collecting the same data, or even if we're collecting, partially the same data, is there a way of one of us stopping to collect some of that data and sharing the data? So let me use an example of Connects Ontario, which is the organization that provides connectivity to people who are seeking treatment for drug, alcohol, problem gambling. We and they collect all the information about organizations that provide service in that area. They collect a deeper level of data than we do in some different data fields. So we began an exercise of first sharing our data fields. What do we actually collect in terms of those organizations? What do we each need in terms of that collection? Is there a way of us now looking at a sharing model that says, we or you will stop collecting some of that information and instead use your collection process and feed into one another? There's lots of issues that come into play in terms of how you do that, technology and, the way in which people have different organizations have different quality assurance and quality standards in terms of their data collection policies, all that kind of thing. But the public benefit of doing that kind of thing is huge. I don't go through a day without someone telling me about someone's bright idea to collect data, which I know is already collected. and it drives you nuts because the reason it's being collected is because it's not being shared, one. And that additional collection is simply going to be wasteful. But then third, the likelihood of that data being collected and then not being maintained is incredibly high. So, you know, there's no end of reasons why we should be doing this, but the getting there is a little bit of a courtship. And it requires trust and it requires a dialogue in order to say we have a common interest, we have a common public interest that we're pursuing, and a recognition, and this is often hard for nonprofits and for governments to admit, we're wasting resources. And to be able to admit that you're doing that and you should do something about it.
Okay, I see a couple of hands up.
Yeah, so I've been listening for the last half hour. Everyone's using the word data in a very different way. And so my question is, well, what all do you need and how do you know who has what? Is there, you know, before you start asking for raw data sets, is there a mechanism where you can read to find out who's published summary data so that you know who to ask for the raw data sets? Is there like a journal of nonprofits?
When you write that
interesting things. I mean, because I work, so I'm a statistician by training. I work in the medical research field, and even within one therapeutic area, it's hard enough to get the data that you want. And these are very specific outcomes. So you're talking like all over the spectrum here. And I think, like, in order to succeed, you need to know who has what and who wants what. And before you even ask for raw data, you know, just ask if they can offer you some summary data, and then you can proceed that way.
So I'm just going to say that catalog problem is not specific to nonprofits. Even with governments, it's the same question. It's like a chicken and an egg, and it's more between the users of the data, like technologists would say, what data do you have? And the government agent would come back and say, well, what do you want? and it's like a chicken and an egg that goes back and forth. And maybe it's like Bill says, a little bit of a dance, and you show me a little bit of mine, and I'll show you a little bit of yours.
But it seems like if you have someone standing in the middle as a clearinghouse, that would help the most people in the
possible.
They have to go through the same dance in order to get others to participate.
Well, yeah, but
someone's
got to take it for the team, right?
There are people trying to solve this problem of like building common API standards and common data standards, and you know, if you look at CCAN, I mean, that's a way to try and think about how we're going to organize the data and find it. I would love a master search of GitHub for everything in the world. I would like a master search for data. And that front end, there's enough people out there that really want it. I don't know if it'll happen in the near future, but I hear you. It's really about a data expedition. Like, what am I going to find today? Who do I know? Like, it really is a hunt and gather.
Yeah. And just quickly, so there was a project by BuzzData, I think, that allowed journalist types or anybody else for that matter to post questions saying, we need this. This is my question, is there data supported? And there'd be people from the other side saying, yes, there is data, and there'd be technology saying, yes, we can construct in such a way to make it useful. But that project kind of tanked.
Yeah. Well, I think it pivoted somewhere a bit more.
I have things about learning we can talk about.
Actually, the question you asked was similar to what I was ruminating on. It's that a lot of the discussions are about big data. Like I have clients who call me and say, we want to do big data. And I say, well, you don't have any little data. So you have to put in some tools to start collecting data. And they'll have like literally boxes of papers of trade show attendees and all sorts of things. And nobody wants to be the one who has to like type it in. So a lot of this sort of information just builds up and builds up and builds up until the person who's responsible for it either quits or runs or whatever. So it's like, it's when you're talking about chicken and the egg, it's like, there are CRM tools that are starting to be adopted. Like I'm working with Civic CRM tools right now. I know there's like Razor's Edge, there's all these tools out there. But the point is, it's a tough sell. Like just trying to get them past that, okay, if you want to do the big stuff, you gotta, the names have to be spelled properly. You know, the birth dates have to be correct. The amounts have to be correct.
So can we talk a little bit about the costs of sharing and opening data in terms of both cleaning data or making it, let's say it's on paper and you want to make it machine readable?
I think that, did you want to go? No, thanks. I think for cleaning data, you have to, for cleaning data, there's a couple of things. First of all, before you even start cleaning data, do you have the right data set? Like, have you contacted and found the right information? I mean, a lot of people, when you start to talk about what your mission is, I think Bill was mentioning that. I sat with a room full of people in Seattle talking about, oh, we're gonna document all the 911 calls. I'm like, is that what the community needs? Do they need the 911 calls? What else do they need? Maybe they need to know what the parks are. So I mean, always asking the right question is really core. In terms of cleaning it, I think people get a little overwhelmed when you say, I have to data clean, and frankly, I have data sets that I haven't cleaned and I refuse to release because it has personal information in it. And I work for an open source company. And so I'm just gonna be transparent in that. And the reason I won't release it is I'd rather not put people in harm's way. So what tools can you use to find out how to do that? Well, OKFN has a school of data, and they actually go through the steps to kind of train and show you how to do that. You can join some of the mailing lists and learn along the way. You can teach yourself regular expressions, but I mean, that's a little bit of a tough go. But I think you have to think about like what you're doing and what your mission is, and can you get help? And I think a lot of volunteers out there who are data scientists, and I think that DataKind will be holding that hackathon in a couple of weeks, they're trying to figure out solid ways to ask the right questions and help people on that journey. And I think that's really exciting to see that kind of mission come forward so that you can partner data scientists inside your NGOs. And get student interns. I'm telling you, I had 4 this summer. They kicked my bottom.
Anybody else with experience from going, maybe TimeRaiser, from paper to?
Right, so one of the issues that we have is like when we're collecting data about the community that we're serving, we try to do it as much as possible in an already technical form, right? So we'll use Google surveys as opposed to paper surveys, which seems obvious, but you know, that's one way we've been doing that. And just recently I was helping a nonprofit who did hundreds and hundreds of surveys on paper. And they had a two-pronged problem. One, what you were talking about, essentially, are they asking the right question? They weren't asking necessarily the right questions, for one, but also the amount of work it took for them, the hours, I think it was like, you know, going on 50 hours of work just inputting these surveys. So there's this sort of sense in which, you know, they need to start recognizing these tools that they can afford and utilize, and hopefully be able to utilize those to prevent that data entry issue. I understand that entirely. It's a huge resource pull, certainly.
Yep, in the back.
Hi. I work for a program called HomoClass. It's a network. It's a network of it's a program called HomoClass, and we're responsible for taking people home from hospitals. And it's a partnership amongst 7 community organizations. So it runs out of St. Chris, and the way they got everybody involved on it is there's a lot of stats run. So the funding's tied to the stats. It started in 2008, and the way you got everybody involved in it is that it increases your client base. A lot of people that would have gotten lost in the system that are getting out of the hospitals are then trapped in the system, and the stats are all kept for pretty much everything. And I think that's pretty much the way you get people collecting the data. Is it has to be beneficial to the organization to a certain degree. You have to piece that side of it, but the larger picture is also taken care of as well, so that the people are kind of taken care of individually. One of the things that I've seen is that a lot of older programs don't capture any information on their programs, and that's where the struggle is getting the workers to necessarily want to capture that data, because there's a lot of resistance on that front. And that's going to take some time, but I feel with the newer programs, it's generally tied to the funding, because if the numbers aren't there to prove that the work is actually beneficial to the people, then it's not going to get funded and picked up for funding. So I think it's moving in the right direction. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
I want to stress, don't start with a large project, start with something small, and then you can prove your case, right? Start with something small and prove your case with that to your colleagues, to your management, to your management, but also your network. I'll bet with your, what is it called, Home at Last? There's a network of people who might be able to volunteer on that and just help out with a small project on a weekend on a Saturday, right? If they knew what your data project mission was and you trusted them and you vetted them, like that would be an interesting, like, micro kind of action.
Yeah. I have a question. I'd be interested in seeing a show of hands of those who are working within nonprofits or with nonprofits on a consulting basis. who would say that your nonprofit is kind of like on the ball when it comes to data? There's like a pretty okay sort of data management strategy in place, that you kind of got the data that you need.
First of all, you have to find out who's working. Well, no, I mean, get the denominator first before you ask for a numerator.
I mean, it's subjective at this point. Is it meeting your needs? Sort of.
For the most part of the
Okay. Well, that's interesting.
So I'd respond to you by saying that I think that many not-for-profits are not proactive, do not have an information strategy or roadmap. They are responding in panic mode to the next request that comes to them from a prospective funder for data.
Mm-hmm.
I open that to comment.
So I guess, I mean, my then question would be sort of like, what are the barriers, or like how could we overcome this problem in the sector?
So my nonprofit doesn't meet our data needs to do what we need to do, but it's getting there, which is really exciting. So it's kind of cool to come to this talk and feel like, yeah, we're doing this, but we're just in a very early stage of development in terms of setting up, okay, how can we collect this data? Because we're collecting data from kids from grade 1 to 12, their teachers and volunteers who come deliver programs in classrooms. And to do it, we've had to break it down. Okay, how do you get data from grade 1 to 3? And then so on and so on. And then really incrementally do all this stuff and find out, okay, what kind of information we want to get. And though this nonprofit organization has been around for a long time, they were collecting data very sporadically before. And it's just taken, for some reason, the organizational culture to really slowly shift and say, this is important, we're doing it, and we're taking our time. So I feel like I'm a little bit more of an optimist than this gentleman here in that, yeah, I think nonprofits are getting along and doing this. This is why we're all here. And that it's not a total mismanagement thing. It's just like, how do we get the resources and get everybody to get on board?
So can we throw the question back to the panel? What are some barriers you've come across, and how have you overcome them?
Well, there's a lot of barriers in that. You know, I started out, you know, the one set of notes I made was about the challenges, and it's nearly a page long, just in terms of the ones that I've run up against. And I appreciate this gentleman's comments. We're a disparate set of organizations with the nonprofit sector with lots of different focuses and lots of different needs. But I would just say that I think that, you know, this is a work in progress, and the whole notion of business intelligence for many is still fairly new, and it's, you know, a lot of the organizations that I've worked with, you know, they're so head down busy doing, and quite frankly are, you know, have very little time to pull up the head and say, well, how about we collect the data so we can figure out how to do a better job? You know, it may seem crazy, but there's a little bit of, in some cases within the nonprofit sector, a bit of you know, fatigue in terms of doing the work, and sometimes collecting the data can almost seem like it's getting in the way of doing the work until you see what the value of that data is to doing the work better. But, you know, just very quickly in the top 10 of the list of challenges: compatible technology, compatible data structures, understanding what is the value to me in terms of why I would share that data, and how, you know, what's in it for me is a key question. If there's nothing in it for me, then simply sharing it, well, why would I? But issues of turf, issues of time and resources and focus, as I mentioned, and issues of perceived ownership, and whether or not we're in fact willing to, you know, open up the kimono and share the data. Sometimes there's real limits to that. So just some of the key kind of things that I run up against in terms of what prevents sharing. Some of those are the reasons that make it difficult to share. Are those issues overcomable? Absolutely, but it takes work.
I'm going to write a rap song with all that in there. Totally going to take it and make it something else.
Heather, different barriers you overcome?
I was just thinking in one of I think the main barrier that's coming in here is the thought that your impact reporting or the data you're collecting is something you do after you do what you do. And so one of the approaches we have as an organization is to try to make the way that we work do that work for us. So like, it's finding the right tools that are compatible, like Bill was saying. So for example, one example would be that we use Salesforce as our CRM. And right now I'm doing a total rebuild of our database because I don't think we were collecting the right information in the right way, or we were forcing ourselves to do the work twice. So one good example would be when we're selling tickets, when we're doing tickets for our events. That program we use is Eventbrite. It plugs into my Salesforce. I have a survey in Eventbrite. All of that data about my attendees are immediately uploaded into my database. So that's a very specific example to us, I understand, but it's really building all those systems so that when I'm there and I'm doing that import, I've done all of that work. There's not a sense in which, oh God, there's a funding deadline coming up, I need to know my demographics, right? It's built into everything we do. I built the structure that way. So like I say, we're even working towards that kind of connection between all of our tools, but keeping that in mind, I think will overcome a lot of those obstacles.
One of the best parts about working at Ushahidi, and one of the hardest reasons to transfer to my new role at Open Knowledge, is that I get, and I'm sure I'll be doing this at Open Knowledge as well, is that I get to meet all these unusual suspects, whether they be mapping harassment or working on land claims, working on election rights, or even crisis response or disaster zones, is that each one of these mini projects are either tied to an NGO or tied to a nonprofit, or they're just regular people in the community who really believe in it. And I say to them all the time that they're really have a lot more power. And I think I would like to +1 on all things that that my colleagues have said, but I think that the biggest barrier for folks is to know what their power is in their network and in their community, and that if they could see that they could activate that, and that comes as a community manager and as somebody who has done that. I have gotten 200 people to map around the world, map on Kenya elections. I've had a couple thousand people work on the Haiti earthquake with me, with a bunch of other people around the world, and that's surge support. Yes, so I understand surge support versus longevity, and not the unsexy data things, the everyday sexy data things, which I think we need to make sexy. I think we need to say this is really important to Home at Last. This is really important to my environmental project. So I would suggest the following, that one of the biggest barriers is ourselves. If we could start to look to our communities and our networks, not just as our funders, but as our participants on this journey for our change that we want to affect, then we can see that gift of the interaction, and maybe even see a way that they can contribute, not just financially, but by their knowledge resources and by their power. And so that might sound very pep talky. However, I will say that, you know, I've seen it again and again when I talk to these little community projects, and again, I can't state enough that these are not North Americans I'm speaking with. These are people from Venezuela. These are people from Liberia, like Uganda, and they go out there and they start to think about, like, who can I ask for help who might be able to contribute? And what can I make the small ask and the large ask to help them do that? And it's amazing how they can take and make their data scramble or their information overload, and how they can find ways to negotiate that. But it means a restructure in how you think about who your network is and who your funders are. And that's a barrier.
So the question I want to get to is kind of, if I'm a nonprofit that is ready to start changing it, and the analogy maybe was, I'm not ready to dive in, but maybe to get my feet wet.
Yeah.
And I published my annual report as a PDF or as a web page on our website. What's the next step I could take in opening up more data?
Don't publish it as a PDF so that I have to go get a program to read it and scrape it. But that's okay, because there's free programs to do that. That's step 1.
So yeah, that's a good step 1. I mentioned, I think, in my intro that we do what we call web audits on nonprofits. When we built out an evaluation matrix for that, and it's the average is putting a PDF of your annual report up there. There's people that, there's organizations that do less than that. But I think the reality of it, and everyone in this room realizes, no one sits down with a mug of tea and curls up with an annual report. So much. Sorry, was that?
We get it done.
And like, I'm not to say that none of us have never read an annual report. Of course we have. I didn't think that would be quite so. Is it just me?
I'm here for you.
Okay. I love the contents of annual reports. I will put that there. So I think as much as possible, making that information. Not necessarily getting rid of your annual report. Of course, there's going to be funders and other individuals who want that annual report, but sort of surfacing all the great things that you do and putting those sort of more dynamically onto your website or in your Facebook or Twitter communities, and really not hiding those successes away in your annual report.
Let me go with an even more fundamental step though, and that is look around your shop at what you have. Amazingly enough, lots of organizations collect information and then for various reasons, but don't necessarily look at it in terms of whether or not there's some value to sharing that data, and we sometimes don't recognize that there is. And let me use my own example in United Way. All United Ways collect information about how much money they raise and in different categories and all that kind of thing. We actually haven't been that very good about then sharing that amongst ourselves, let alone sharing it with others. We share it with the public in terms of how much total campaign money we raise. And our ability to actually begin to share that data with ourselves in a more detailed way has now resulted in some real ahas where we're increasingly able to look at changes that are happening in sectors of our economy that's impacting the way in which we're able to generate revenue, and what you might do about that, and changes that you need to maybe get out ahead of with your colleagues in terms of doing stuff. So I'd say look in your own cupboard in terms of what you have, and maybe some people who maybe collect those things aren't the ones that can recognize the value. So sharing that internally in terms of what you have within your own staff group and within your own board might be the first way of recognizing that there's some hidden gold in there.
I think to build on what Bill said, I think not only just share it internally, but think about you as potential advocates, because you're here today, so you're now dispatched. Go forth and make awesome. But the concept of an internal hackathon, I'm going to use that word, or internal data scramble or internal sharing is something that even IBM does. They have internal days where they create things and they work with NGOs and they have projects for that. So if you can only just share amongst yourself, that's a good start to be able to kind of build your network of people who might be your advocates. And I would make that, again, make it a project day. We had a website hack day at my organization where everybody in the organization built one piece of the website in terms of content. And they when I asked them, I said, listen, I think you need this. And you have this amazing graphic design skill. You're great with photos. All of a sudden they feel empowered to do that. But I mean, to take a day to just do data scrambling, that sounds like a hard thing to do. But there's lots of models out there from Sunlight Foundation or other folks out there that can teach you how to build that. You just have to look or ask people like us.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to turn it like a technical thing, but are there any kind of conventions that everyone can kind of agree on in terms of how to organize this information, in terms of contacts and messages? And like I said, I don't want to push the database part of it, but one of the biggest problems I'm having is, even with some informal polling I did, is that a lot of the clients I'm dealing with are using things like MailChimp and Constant Contact, and they're kind of really losing touch with what their data is. So it's hard to explain to them that you're dealing with contact data, and then if you do a campaign, you're dealing with, let's say, messages or whatever. So it's, instead of everything sort of getting rationalized, it seems to be getting a little bit more obfuscated as they sort of pass these tasks off to these services or whatever. And I don't evangelize, but I'm pushing the Civic CRM thing. Okay,
they're good. That's a good piece of software.
Yes, and like I said, I would exhort everyone to get out there.
So the question I think was about technology standards and data standards, and can we talk a little bit about that? Get a little techie. Gabe?
Well, I mean, there's certainly different approaches to this. I think that if we're talking about the realm of sharing with the world, I think that not the best thing, but the best good thing would be to get it up in whatever format. And like Heather says, there's tools that will help those who want it to get it into the format they need. If that's the barrier, then just get it up in whatever format. I think that there's an interesting thing that happens when organizations are using these third-party services and cloud services and things like that, and that they feel less in touch with their data. The vast majority of those services do offer the ability to pull your data out, and so it's buried somewhere in the menu. And so it's typically not hard, and that's probably one of the better kinds of data outputs that you'll get, because it's one that has standards in mind. But I'm sure that's not universal.
I use Campaign Monitor, and I pull reports, and I use reports all the time by location and everything. I find it really helpful. But I mean, this is not tool porn hour. I don't want to not to be rude, but I did want to go back to our gentleman in the front who said, I don't think you all use the word data the same. I love that. Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that up. One of the biggest things I can say about data sets, and when I talk to our community at Ushahidi and anybody else that I work with, especially OpenStreetMap, is context. Context is really important. Add as much detail and notes and definitions, because if I say this is a street but it's actually a back alley, well, those are different things, and how does that translate? Because I deal with global communities, and so my assumption of what is right versus left, totally different ballgame when you're talking about different data sets. So make sure there's lots of descriptors and explanations, and then a context of what the data is. In GitHub, people put GISTs. If you have a wiki, put a wiki information, put notes there, but also put a point of contact. I will tell you, with Random Hacks of Kindness, this global hackathon, 5,000 people around the world, 24/7 for 48 hours. We find that nonprofits will come and say, hey, build this thing, and we're like, hey, this is not useful. I need the owner to tell me information, and so there's some faults in that. Right? So just because there's technology out there doesn't mean that you don't need the human API, which is you. An API is Application Protocol Interface, and you are the Application Protocol Interface.
So the other thing I'd say from a non-techie perspective is that I often am interested in my area, because I think that piece is context being real important is key. But recognize that there aren't so much a common convention is what there is different schools of thought and different approaches and practices. Mm-hmm. So I often referee debates between people who, insist that you can only have a Boolean-based type of searching, and that's the way you should structure your databases, and people that say, no, let's keep it flat, no, it should be relational in this way. We should look at faceted searches and the way in which we, do things. So, there's very, very strongly held views, and some of this dates back hundreds of years in terms of library science and the way we classify information and the way we're able to get it out. So, the reality is you end up in a complex field, and the question comes back: what are you trying to achieve, and how best to achieve it? So strip it down a bit, because if we're looking for the the kind of the universal solvent in terms of data, it's not there. Is my comment.
In terms of data compatibility, so the libraries have solved this problem, the financial industry has solved this problem, the medical industry is sort of getting there. So there's processes in place to solve these problems. Yeah.
I love what you said about what are you trying to achieve, but I'd actually like to see that when surveys come up and you're the person who has to fill it in. I've done surveys where I've started really liking the organization and I want to do the survey, and after 30 minutes of endless questions I say, I'm sorry, I don't have enough time.
They've failed. 30 minutes for a survey, they failed.
Yeah,
they failed.
The thing I wanted to say about what you just said is it would really be great if when you're filling out a survey, they'd actually say what they're going to use the information for.
I don't fill it out unless they tell me.
Yeah, it's just like, just to collect information for the sake of collecting information is just, and just one more thing, the best advice I ever got about doing surveys was never ask any questions unless you're willing to make changes about the response, due to the responses you get. If you
Can't
can't say
share.
just about something, don't ask about it.
Yeah.
So-
It's about feedback loops, right? Like if you're actually responsible and accountable to the people you serve, what are you going to do with that feedback and that information? If you're just going to leave it on a dusty pile of paper, if you're going to action it, that's a more effective way. But also you want to tell them, hey, I heard you, and then I want to do something with that.
There's a question
Sorry,
handed
can I-
at the back. Go ahead.
Can I jump
Yeah.
in?
Go.
Sorry. Just jumping back and thinking about sort of the bigger picture, one of the things, the issues, jumping back is when you're thinking about, you have the data, and you're thinking about sharing it, but then there are reservations perhaps on your board or with other executive members who just worry about how that data, if you share it openly, how it will be used, and if it's going to be used for, I don't know, some cases, for bad purposes. How do you have any advice as to how you can start to have that discussion and get over those barriers, those fears of releasing information widely, or data?
Bill.
I'll quickly just say that we've definitely confronted that. And here's the kind of demarcation point that people often came to in our sector was, yeah, we're willing to share it for public good, but how do we know someone's not going to use it for profit? And quite frankly, you just got to let it go. Once you share it, you don't control it. You got to get over that and recognize that there's the likelihood of more public good coming of this, and if someone's able to make a buck on it somewhere over here, I can't stop that. And but those concerns are always going to come up, and at some point, you have an open discussion about is there more value in hoarding it than there is in sharing it? And in most cases, I think people, when they go down that road, will recognize that there is greater value in hoarding it, and the relative risks that you're trying to protect against.
Do you mean there's more value in sharing?
There's more value in sharing than hoarding. Sorry, I might have said the wrong thing.
It's all about being the thoughtful process, because there are instances I've heard, for example, certain environmental groups don't want to release data about the whereabouts of certain animal groups because it attracts hunters. Like people can make these arguments. So to start that conversation, I would almost recommend just asking sort of what they think might be done with it. So just opening that dialogue and just saying,
what are the risks?
What are the risks? Because it's really easy to say, well, something bad might happen. It's like, okay, I understand that. That's a valuable contribution. Let's talk about what those possibilities are, because there may be possibilities where you say, this is too much of a risk, but just, having that conversation and validating their concerns, but, kind of forcing them to put them into words.
I love the check. Like I keep going back to ICRC, International Red Cross Red Crescent, because they blew my mind. Like I having worked in this field for a little bit, I couldn't believe that they were the ones who kind of set the tone for information standards and data standards. And so people are reading that report and going, okay, and I actually read that report and thought, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to follow them, because I'm sorry, I'm going to read this to you because I think it really makes sense to your question. So their guidelines are, what's the necessity or the capacity for that data? What are the data protection laws? Do no harm, whatever that means, because I think that means different things to different people, much like the word data does. Non-discriminatory or bias, objective information and processing, quality check, and reliability. That's a pretty good list of what to do, and they have pages. You can go read the 50-page document on it. But I mean, they had pages kind of working through, and I think that we can take these. And I think the reason they opened that is that we should take those models and remix them for our organizations. I built a code of conduct for the community for Ushahidi, based on that and a bunch of other code of conducts. And I think the remixing power is going to help us. And as you were saying earlier, it can build on other people's knowledge. I think that's pretty powerful, rather than reinventing it.
So the theme of remixing us or surreptitious discovery or in a way crowdsourcing has come up a couple of times. Anybody want to talk about kind of experiences they've had or about where? I'll talk about one. The city of Vancouver, they had a whole bunch of data on houses that were not being kept up to standards by their landlords, and for years and years, a whole bunch of problems would go unfixed and get thousands of complaints and so on, right? So they decided, hey, we can't solve the problem. We're gonna open up this data and put it on our website and let other people solve the problem. As soon as they mention they're going to open up the data, within 6 months, you know, problems that hadn't been solved for decades got solved. Right? So just an example. That's even before the data was published, right?
That's a great example.
Anybody else an example?
I have one.
Yep.
No, go.
So I'm a crisis mapper, as I mentioned, and so during Hurricane Sandy, U.S. Government released data sets, imagery, satellite imagery for the coastline of damage. And so some friends created something called MapMill, which was using open source software, and took all those data imageries and put it into a piece of software called that looks like Hot or Not for map imagery. So like, not like, disagree, disagree. Okay, so they put up this software and said, let's see what the crowd does, and let's have the crowd do this. But what they did is they didn't take just one vote on the imagery. They pushed it through so that thousands of us would go through and vote, yes, no, this is damaged, go take a second look. And so they overlaid that over their land searches. Right, so they took us, like I'm sat in front of my television and, you know, had it playing in the background and played Hot and Not or Not with satellite imagery. Holy man, like to me that's really powerful. Like I can help my friends in New York and Sandy and help the whole region. I couldn't believe it. The subtext of this is that even though they released that satellite imagery, even though they asked the network to do that, it was the first time that we'd ever been done that. So that's the first time the US government has ever released satellite imagery for general citizens to be able to review it. And I submitted about 10 GitHub tickets, which is like an issue tracker tool. I submitted about 10 tickets to the tool because my friends had created it that I thought were wrong. One of them was I didn't know what good damage or bad damage was. What's the escalation level of it? What should I be looking for? So there were no data standards. So I said, you got to tell me and got to teach me how to do this so that I can help you. And there were a bunch of other things. So we were all working to try and improve this software so that it can be used anywhere else. So despite the fact that it's crowdsourcing, and yes, I tend to talk about it, I think it's more about brain sourcing, right? And really trying to build on each other's knowledge that makes it a little bit better. But there are still kinks to be worked out for sure.
Let me maybe use an example or raise some issues that come up in terms of going down this road. So again, I work in the social and human services sector, and in many cases the services that are made available to vulnerable people, and in some cases those services are sole source. There isn't another option. You know, if you're going to go and apply for social assistance, it's not as though you have 5 different agencies to apply for it from. So in some cases you have an attitude that can slip into our work, which is really that there's so many people that want our service, we don't really have to improve our service delivery. And an attitude can slip in that says the opinion of the consumer doesn't matter to the service delivery, you know, because by virtue of the fact that that person needs help, they've kind of given up some rights within the context of whether or not they really are able to know whether or not the service that they're receiving is a good one or not. So as we approach the notion of allowing clients to rate and make comment about the human and social services that they consume on our website, it resulted in a pretty significant debate and a huge amount of pushback from organizations saying that, you know, how, you know, are people qualified who to make a distinction about whether or not they're getting good service, and, you know, what is the, you know, are we just going to get flamed? Are we just going to get bad comments, you know, and not constructive comments? So I just want to note that in terms of that whole area of crowdsourcing, in some areas it's safe to do it in. In other areas, it's still hugely controversial. But what I find is that there can be a tipping point. You know, even when we went down the road in Toronto of putting a pretty benign kind of indicator on whether or not a restaurant had, you know, was up to snuff in terms of their basic obligations in terms of cleanliness and meeting standards, there was a lot of pushback about that. Quite frankly, once we got over it, there was none. So it's an interesting discussion as we go down the road about how we use crowdsourcing in various areas. and inevitably there's an interesting discussion, and sometimes quite a heated discussion. But I'll just say in the human and social services area, that discussion has not been resolved. And we continue to have challenges that many people bring to the notion that consumers should have a voice.
So on Citizen Voices,
I'll just note that.
No, I appreciate your candor. I'm like having trouble digesting the concept of the citizen's voice and how people react to the incorporation of that. Mainly because I come from the citizen voice side of it, so that's interesting to me. There's an organization called Feedback Labs that started in the United States, but it's a bunch of different non-for-profits out there, including Ushahidi, who are interested in figuring out how do we talk about that feedback loop? How do we put the citizen and the people we're trying to serve? How do we put their needs forward without damaging our funding, without damaging ourselves as we try and figure out how to refabricate our organizations. So we write frequently about how do we do that in different pieces of it. So I'd encourage you to read that blog. You've really given me so much to think about. I'm just like, I'm so sorry, I might just write like this rant post tomorrow.
So
I'll send it to you first.
In the wind down phase, any questions from the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
Just what we were talking about there is one of the things that I've been trying to do is use the existing tools to try to work with data governance issues, which I think everybody here has to navigate. And there's still a lot of bureaucracy to overcome. And the joke is, in order to be able to do some of the simple tasks, I have to go to Facebook to find relationships with people that I'm not allowed to find in our existing data. So when's the catch? It's like, does anybody see when there's going to be a catch up on this, or do we have to kind of walk out there and start protesting until the government opens it up a little bit?
So that's
Alliance.
So I'll repeat the question for the mic. So there's this whole world of data that the nonprofits own, but now we're also talking about combining the data with private, commercial, social networking sites like Facebook. Any comments?
Well,
yeah.
Can I just say, I think there's different standards that are applied. As was noted earlier, in many of those commercial sites, you kind of, sell your soul in order to participate in the sense that, everything's open. In the nonprofit sector and in government, we're often held to a different standard where we have to go through a more intentional process that doesn't simply say to the client, like I can't say to a client coming to 211, we're going to collect your data and do anything we want with it, and you have, no say in that. There's an obligation that goes a bit further. So, yeah, is there a catch-up? Yeah, because I think public attitudes are quickly changing. Like I'm gobsmacked when I go on patients like us, or some of those medical sites, and people are putting up their medical records, of their own free will, and yet I come from an old school. I think, wow, that's amazing. I've got a unlisted phone number. So there's different attitudes that come into play and different motivations that people have. But I would say that there, in terms of the commercial sphere and the nonprofit and government sphere, there are different mores and different standards that apply and different motivations. But it's also sometimes pointing up the contradiction in some of those and the degree to which there's a lag as we go through that. But I think it's an important thing for us to intentionally go through that and not just say, it's fair game, and we can do anything we want with your data, which is what commercial sites often say.
I think that Andre Verdi, who works at UNOCHA, he had a bunch of summer students this year work with him to try and map out what is the ecosystem of funders and citizens and UN governments, and he built a mapping tool to be able to try and figure out the pathways for humanitarian aid. And I think that each of us has to try and figure out what that is for each of our sectors. What does that physical map look like? And who are those connections? And so yes, of course, our personal connections, like I know Ushnish from like Free Cycle and open source stuff, and we keep on running into each other because we're very passionate about these things. But how do you find those other people? Well, that's about a mapping exercise at a higher level to be able to determine, maybe there's people out there that might be able to collaborate with you at a different level and find that data set that might relate to it. But I think that's a hard thing to do, and I would look at Andre's site and just see like how he did it and just steal his model. He really puts it out there. Verity Think, V-E-R-I-T-Y, and then his blog is Think, so T-H-I-N-K. So if you just Google that, you'll find Andre Verity, and he's put it out there to say, listen, we need to start having these conversations. So it's got to trickle into everybody's work eventually.
Okay. So my last question to you guys, and then maybe out to the group is there one website or an event coming up that you want to mention that people can go to learn more about open data? Gabe?
Well, Mel beat me to it, but Joey Robinson, who's in the back, is organizing Data for Good, which is a datathon that's specifically about bringing together data scientists to work on some project for good. So there are, I think, a few non-profits that are the sort of clients, and essentially that these data scientists will be applying their skills to work on the kinds of problems that those nonprofits are facing. So if you're interested in that event, then definitely connect with Joy.
And we tweeted out the link to it as well.
Okay, great.
Okay. Well, you guys are going to go to Heather last because she's going to have
She'll have the most. Well, at our offices, we're going to be hosting an ecology and technology seminar where we're going to be talking. We share office space with the working group, who's a mobile app developer, and so we're coming together to and bringing some biologists into the room and talk about how biologists and other scientists are sharing data or using these new technologies. I'm blanking on the. I think it will be on September 21st, but if you check out the TimeRaiser.ca website, you'll be able to find out the exact time. I'm blanking on the exact date.
Bill?
No, I'll pass. Yep.
Okay, so I'm gonna sub in for Melanie, and then I'll say my own. Okay, so Melanie's organizing Random Hacks of Kindness in December, which will also be doing aggregation of data and also looking at ways to serve local NGOs and nonprofits. So do get in contact with Melanie about Random Hacks. I'm a big Random Hacks supporter and try to go to different cities. I want to give a big up to DataKind, the people who will be doing the Data for Social Good. I really have a sweet spot for Jake Corway. If you're a doubter, go read his blog post that he wrote for Harvard Business Review. It's basically you can't just hack your way to social change. It really goes into like what deep, meaningful work needs to happen to make this happen, and I think DataKind really has a good model for that. So this is their first event in Canada, so much love for them. And yes.
Thank you for the shout out. And also, I just wanted to say to this room that we have one spot left. So if you are at all inspired by what you heard tonight, then please stay and talk with me because we're trying to fill that spot this week.
I'd encourage you to be a fly on a wall at tech events or hackathons. Don't be shy to go because the way that you're going to learn is just to observe. And the event for myself is OKCon is this week. And that's the Open Knowledge Conference. 1,000 people are going to be meeting in Geneva. Yes, I know I can't afford your plane tickets. I'm so sorry about that. But what you can do is watch it on Twitter. Watch the OKCon web stream. There's people who are talking about open environment, open spending, open libraries, you name it. They're talking about open science. And so the way that you can learn is just by watching those kinds of people. I think that they'll try and stream some of it. I'm not sure. It's my first day walking into the job, so I'll find out and I'll let you know. Just follow me. But definitely following those kinds of organizations and just following the hashtags Open Data or OKCon or OKFN, DataKind. A whole whack of us are trying to figure out how to build this space. And when I say build this space, this is such new ground, as Bill said. So you're on the journey now to help build this in your organizations for sure. So welcome.
Anybody want to turn a quick website or event?
May I just ask colleague Matthias here, is anybody interested in starting up meetup, interest group, or any ad hoc collaborating platform for, let's say, we are a project, we are depending on big guys, big data source, and we have problem with them, and we depend on them in order to monitor changes on their side, on which we depend, our community depend, our group depend. Let's start a group, interest group. Is anybody interested to start any kind of interest group? Like similar like meetup within Net Tuesday, subsection within Net Tuesday, or separate?
I suggest they go talk to them. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. I'm sure somebody like Gabe's interested in stuff like that.
So if you're interested, yeah, how about we go talk to you at the end of the meetup? That'd be great.
Okay, any other quick websites or tips or events? Otherwise,
Data.to, OpenGov.
Yeah, does everybody, by the way,
Mail.
know the government, since you're nonprofits, you should probably check out the government websites.
Data.gc.ca,
That's a federal one.
Open Data TO, there's
Toronto.
a Data TO mailing list, there's an Open Government mailing list, there's an Open Data
And
mailing
we'll,
list.
we'll hopefully put them up on
Yeah.
the.
Just even if you're a fly on the wall, you can learn what other people are doing and then quietly ask some questions on the side if you're shy.